Role-playing games are, by their very nature, time-intensive affairs. Much grander than your average run-and-gunner, they require players to understand and utilise deeper systems, which in turn brings them further into their expansive worlds. The best RPGs have immersive stories, interesting characters and settings that can entrance and delight. So if an RPG under-delivers in these key areas, you better not be dozens of hours in before you realise the grave error you've made by giving it the benefit of the doubt. I'm Cy for WhatCulture.com, and these are the 10 worst RPG video games of all time. Number 10, Quest 64. Maybe Quest 64 serves a purpose as someone's very first introduction to the roleplay genre, but if you're looking for a single scrap of depth or individuality, then you should look literally anywhere else. I mean, the fact that Imagineer couldn't think of a better name for their N64 RPG than Quest 64 is telling enough, and we haven't even made it past the box yet. The real issue is that Quest 64 makes no attempts to separate itself from other games or even the past. Its story is trite at best, its battle system is tired, and its general gameplay is witheringly basic. Generic protagonist child, or as the game calls him, Brian, can wield the 4 standard RPG elemental spells. Encountering new enemies is a standard affair of trial and error trying to identify their arbitrary weakness. Battles take place by interrupting overworld exploration a la Chrono Trigger, but the wildly swinging camera means that once you're done, it's all too easy to get lost and turned around in Quest 64's unremarkable world. There had been concerns that Nintendo's 64-bit machine and its cartridge system was going to struggle to produce compelling RPGs in that era. Considering that Quest 64 launched after the PlayStation mega hit Final Fantasy VII, it did an indisputably good job of confirming that theory. Number 9, Digimon World 2. Now, I don't have a whole lot of personal knowledge on the Digimon franchise, nor the various video games that the property has produced, but it seems as though the Digimon World series doesn't know what it is. Sometimes it's a Tamagotchi sim, sometimes a mystery dungeon clone. If you're a Digimon fan, then you might find something to like about Digimon World 2, but that doesn't stop it from being one of the most boring dungeon crawlers ever released. Mystery dungeon games, by their very nature, just work a lot better on handheld systems, so Digimon World 2 inherently struggles. Rather than something you can pick up and play, it demands a steep time investment. The title marries slow and repetitive gameplay with its worst of bedfellows, insane difficulty spikes that demand players to grind to sweet heaven to stand a chance. Dungeon progression is tedious, and your monster running out of energy makes it all the more infuriating when you have to return to the beginning to start all over again. Moreover, it only takes a few hours before each dungeon you've completed starts to blur together in a haze of dull visuals. The phrase dungeon crawler never felt so apt for a game that is so painfully slow and uninteresting in every regard. Number 8, Hyperdimension Neptunia. Hyperdimension Neptunia is set in an alternate timeline of game industry. This world is fractured, divided into regions that parody different parts of the so-called console war, such as Last Station, Louis, and Leanbox. Fun, right? Seems like an amusing thing to parody, considering that the console war itself is inherently ridiculous. What if I told you that's where the fun completely stops? Hyperdimension Neptunia really should have just cut the RPG elements out of its game, as it has all the making of your regular baseline of trash for a visual novel. Underdressed, over-sexualized anime girls fill the title from top to bottom and spend their time chatting absolute nonsense. But you'll beg for this portion of the game back when Hyperdimension decides to drop you into some of the most underdeveloped dungeons you've ever seen and asks of you to essentially fill a quota of monsters defeated. This means slogging through the game's terrible, poor excuse for a turn-based battle system which, whilst it does have an interesting combo system, is basically left unexplained. It's sluggish and dull and feels ultimately tacked on, probably for very good reason. The promise of a game parodying the 7th generation console war could have actually made for something fresh, but Hyperdimension Neptunia's vapid and constantly sexist vibe makes you feel nothing but shame. Number 7, Mass Effect Andromeda. The original Mass Effect trilogy can be called one of the biggest triumphs of the Xbox 360 and PS3 era. With the story of Commander Shepard and crew concluded though, fans would have to wait a full 7 years for the next installment. Mass Effect Andromeda may well be most famous for the glitchy state it launched in, including but not limited to its nightmarish inability to render faces properly. Texture pop-ins happened regularly at launch, as did a lot of gameplay freezes as players explored the new open world landscapes. The issues were deeper than mere bugs though. The game was also criticised for its slow plot that retread too much familiar ground and didn't offer enough variety to set it apart from the original trilogy. The open world elements use a lot of copy and pasting to fill them, and the same can be said about the game's side missions. Even if the combat was more fluid, it just didn't feel like the next big step that we were all waiting for, and thus Andromeda hit the deck with a big dull clang rather than took flight. The title's poor reception temporarily put the franchise on ice so that Bethesda Edmonton could instead focus on the new IP Anthem, However, since that game also flopped, it seems that not all is lost, and a follow-up to Mass Effect Andromeda may at least be on the way. Number 6, Final Fantasy XIV, version 1. If you're forced to wipe your game from the face of the earth and start again, that's probably a good indicator that you've created something pretty awful. This one ends well, but Final Fantasy XIV was dragged through broken glass to get there. Performance issues were one of the biggest problems that caused FF14's downfall, although that's not forgiving the game's frankly terrible interface. It looked nice and there was clearly some degree of fun to be had, but it was buried under technical troubles as well as what appeared to be a pretty severe degree of grind. Square Enix extended the game's trial period multiple times to keep players involved, but behind the scenes big changes were happening to try and save face in the long run. Players that stuck with Final Fantasy XIV saw the in-game story culminate in a world-ending event that resulted in these servers being turned off. A month later, the alpha test for Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn, began. Built from the ground up and helmed by a new director, this 2.0 version of the game was much more in line with player expectation. Since its re-release in 2014, Final Fantasy XIV has gone on to become one of the most successful MMORPGs of all time, a rather large pendulum swing considering the original version cost Square a lot of money and a lot of player faith. Number 5, Overlord, Fellowship of Evil. In 2007, Codemasters released Overlord, and whilst it didn't set the world on fire, it was a warmly received comedy fantasy romp. Players assumed the role of an evil warrior, growing and commanding their multi-talented minion army like the twisted version of Pikmin. So the case is with success, further entries in the fledgling IP were commissioned. A sequel and 2 spin-offs all came in 2009 to surprisingly decent review scores before all went quiet on the Overlord front until 2015. Overlord, Fellowship of Evil was, instead of the next-gen follow-up, yet another spin-off for the franchise, and it brought drastic changes to the existing formula, taking the series to a top-down perspective and turning the variety of options down to near zero. Fellowship of Evil is the most boring Diablo clone you can imagine, in both its dull gameplay and its brown and red quote-unquote visual design. All of the fun of the minions from the previous installments is now reduced to unnecessary fluff, since Fellowship of Evil requires no more than mashing the attack button for 7 hours. You pretty much never even need to grab loot and upgrade your character, as the challenge is already hysterically low. Writer Rhianna Pratchett claimed the game was its own entity and doesn't stop Overlord 3 from existing, but considering the franchise has laid completely dormant for the last 7 years, we may be inclined to disagree. Number 4, Sonic Chronicles, The Dark Brotherhood. Sonic Chronicles, if you're pessimistic, can be looked at as yet another example of Sonic Team saying, anything Mario does, we can also attempt. Considering that the core ideal of Sonic the Hedgehog is momentum, it may seem like the franchise and the turn-based JRPG system are at odds with each other. Thus, developers BioWare tried their best to create combat that tried some new things. Sadly, the end result is a messy, overbearing and hand-holding experience that quite simply was not fun. The battle system requires intensive use of the DS's touchscreen, which gets old fast, but even worse is that you also have to use the touchscreen to move Sonic around the world, which is immediately cumbersome. Slap this on top of a bunch of empty and pretty uninspired settings that rarely make good use of Sonic's established style, and you're on a fast track to a bad time. Unlike Sonic platformers being an RPG, Dark Brotherhood is dialogue heavy, which has its ups and downs. The characters are well written, and we actually do get a few cool story moments that affect the lore of the Sonic universe, such as some info about Knuckles' past, but unfortunately it's too few and too infrequent for a 16-hour RPG, and the story amounts to very little. This includes a cliffhanger ending because the Chronicles series starts and ends with this one failed experiment. Number 3, Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XII was defined by its very open environment and its experimental battle system, which was closer to an MMO than a traditional command-based system. Final Fantasy XIII flipped all of this on its head, returning to a more familiar kind of turn-based battle system and, for whatever reason, turning essentially every area of the game into a long, empty hallway. What sets RPGs apart from other genres should be the player's desire to get invested into the game's world and the fact they are left to do so how they see fit. Square certainly believed in Cocoon as they announced that Final Fantasy XIII would be just one game in an entire collection of titles from that world. From a player perspective, however, the world and thus the game feels very shallow as there's nothing to do, nowhere to explore and no one to talk to. Apparently the game opens up after Chapter 10, but the simple fact is that if I have to invest 25 hours into your title before it gets good, then, well, that's 25 hours I could be investing into literally anything else. Additionally, Final Fantasy XIII's overblown writing would feel like a parody if not for the fact it takes itself seriously. Almost every character in the game is hideously boring or alarmingly annoying, and sometimes both. Looking at you, Snow. Number 2, Two Worlds. The Xbox 360 wasn't exactly a console known for its RPGs, and so Two Worlds was a rare case. Regrettably, it billed itself as the Oblivion killer, hoping to outdo the Elder Scrolls' latest major hit. That's a bold claim for anyone to make, but Two Worlds was setting itself up to disappoint a lot of people with the level of hype it was generating. It's not a great sign if you avoid paying for a professional recording studio and do it all in-house, and it's an even worse sign if you have the same approach to writing your game. It's a role-playing game. Story and script are some pretty key factors, and thus Two Worlds' plot was both poor in content and delivery. It doesn't stop there though, as the game itself was tragically undercooked when it arrived with the constant streams of bugs of all kinds. Objects popping into existence, textures vanishing, NPCs walking through solid objects, and all of that is before getting to the combat that caused the frame rate to chug. But Two Worlds did deliver on some of its promises. It did include horseback combat, unlike Oblivion. Unfortunately, this mechanic feels more like balancing glass vases on skateboards on your forearms with how bad the controls are, which means that the chugging yet insanely easy on-foot combat is a better option 100% of the time. So yeah, take that, Oblivion. Number 1, LUNAR Dragon Song. Those of us in Europe may not have ever heard of the LUNAR RPG series before because it never came to our part of the world despite some decent success during the 90s on the likes of the Sega CD and the Sega Game Gear. The final game in the series, LUNAR Dragon Song, is the only entry we've ever had. Disheartening because even after a 10-year wait since the previous game, it absolutely sucked. LUNAR Dragon Song goes the total opposite way to games like Quest 64 and, in an effort to mix up the formula, innovates in ways that nobody wants. The most painful of these is admonishing the player for sprinting by making them take damage. Sure, maybe I could understand that there should be a punishment for avoiding battles in the overworld, but this also applies to, say, the hallway of your local inn. Is their carpet covered in upturned thumbtacks or something? Maybe we wouldn't be running away from enemies if your battle system wasn't an uncomfortable mess. Dragon Quest II, 20 years earlier, let me select a specific target out of all of those on screen, so why can't you, LUNAR Dragon Song? Further features include saving dev time by turning town exploration into literally a map that you select the building you want to enter, a total lack of voice acting, and animations that cause the game to lag. You know what, Japan? You can keep this one. And that's the list. Let us know down in the comments below what you thought of this video and of any other terrible RPG games that you've experienced. Make sure you like this video, subscribe for more, hit the notification bell and share it with your friends. I'm Si from WhatCulture, and have a good week.